Alright class, today we will conclude our Unit 4B with Tools of Monetary Policy. But before we do that, please ensure that you take out your homework and check off to make sure that what you've answered is correct and consistent with what the textbook says. So check over your homework answers here. Make sure you are looking through and pausing as you need, and answer any questions and ask me questions. If you have any, send me messages over Edsby and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So again, reminder for these set of questions, the textbook does the inflation premium a little bit differently than I do in my example. So again, if you're answering questions on a test, I'll accept both methodology as correct because both are valid, but please ensure you look and learn both if you can. So today we're going to look at tools of monetary policy. We want to know how interest rates are set and how they determine monetary policy, working with a monetary policy to conduct aggregate supply and aggregate demand analyses, and understand how monetary policy can impact the economy with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And so ultimately, at the end of this lesson, you'll want to be able to figure out how does monetary policy impact aggregate supply and aggregate demand models, and of course, completion and review of your homework. So let's get straight to it. Monetary policy. The Bank of Canada has a goal to keep inflation between 1% and 3%. And we talked about this before. No inflation means no growth, theoretically. So the Bank of Canada wants to keep inflation at that level to ensure that it is a sign of growth, that we are growing to a certain degree, but inflation not being 5, 6, 10%, being far too high. A rate of 1 to 3% is reasonable and manageable according to the Bank of Canada. And so how does the Bank of Canada accomplish this goal to keep inflation in that target range, as well as to keep GDP high and employment high as well? So we would do that by using the tools of monetary policy. And just like fiscal policy had the tools of taxation and spending, the tools of monetary policy are interest rates and money supply. So it's important to understand, how is the Bank of Canada actually going to influence interest rates? How do they control what other banks do with their interest rates? That's a kind of a difficult question. So it's important to understand what the overnight rate target is that we're going to look at. And so the overnight rate target is a value that controls what the banks borrow at and what they lend at. And so let's give you an example. So the Bank of Canada will lend money to chartered banks at the bank rate, which we talked about last lesson very briefly. And the Bank of Canada will pay interest at 50 basis points below that bank rate. And so here's the example. So if our bank rate is 4%, the Bank of Canada will borrow at 3.5%. So this 50 basis point band is called the operating band. So let's just talk about this a little bit. So the Bank of Canada can push money into the banks or deposit money into the banks, the charter banks, right? And so the charter banks will pay the Bank of Canada the bank rate of 4% as an example. If this is the bank rate, that means the borrowing rate is 3.5%. And what's this borrowing rate? The borrowing rate is when the charter banks put their money into the Bank of Canada. And so if the banks put their money into the Bank of Canada, that means that the Bank of Canada will pay the banks at 3.5%. So you can see that there's a spread here, right? The banks will earn 4%, the Bank of Canada will earn 4%, and the Bank of Canada will pay at 3.5%. And so they're going to earn 50 basis points of spread. And that's known as the operating band, the 3.5 to 4%, right? And so that's kind of how the Bank of Canada always operates with the charter banks, right? And so I mentioned a number or a thing called the overnight rate target. And that is the actual midpoint of this range, right? This 3.5 to 4%, that's the midpoint, is the overnight rate target. And so you'll notice that 3.75 is this overnight rate target, which is the midpoint of 3.5%, which is the borrowing rate the Bank of Canada pays, and 4%, which is the bank rate, which is what the Bank of Canada receives. And so I'm going to toggle over to the Bank of Canada website to show you what the overnight rate target looks like. So you'll see here that the policy interest rate, or the overnight rate target is what it's called. You'll see here that it is right now 0.25%. it was 0.75%, 1.25% before, and I'll show you a larger chart of these stats. But this is the actual rate that the Bank of Canada has set as the overnight rate target. And so if you look at this number, 0.25%, and then we look back at our PowerPoint, that it says that the overnight rate target is the midpoint of that range. So we're going to see that the midpoint of the range between the bank rate and the borrowing rate is going to be the overnight rate target. And so this overnight rate target is set, and that sets these 2 points up. And so what's the implication of a 0.25 overnight rate target, right? The overnight rate target of 0.25 means that this number is going to be 0.5, and this number is going to be 0. That means the Bank of Canada would borrow at 0 and would get paid at 0.5. And so we're going to examine that a bit more as well. So let's look at this a bit more empirically, so hopefully you can understand it to the fullest degree. And so if we go here to this Excel sheet, our first example showing the overnight rate target at 3.75%. That's what the Bank of Canada will set that number. And then when that number is set, the bank rate and the borrowing rate will also be set. Okay? And so the bank rate is always going to be set at 0.25% or 25 basis points above 3.75, which is the overnight rate target, which will give us a 4% bank rate. The borrowing rate is always set at 0.25% below the overnight rate target. So 3.75 minus 0.25 is 3.5%. And so that's what our first example looked like. And so the implication here is that currently our overnight rate target for the Bank of Canada is 0.25%. And therefore, the bank rate is going to be plus 0.25%, gives us 0.5% bank rate. Okay, so the banks will borrow from the Bank of Canada at 0.5%. The borrowing rate, on the other hand, is 0.25% minus 0.25%, which equals 0%. That means the Bank of Canada borrows from the banks at 0% interest rate. Okay, and so that's the implication of what our overnight rate target currently is. Okay, and so let's look briefly at the history of the overnight rate target, the recent history, I should say, and to look at what significantly has been happening over the past few years. So I'm going to toggle over to another Excel spreadsheet. So now I'm showing you a graph, a chart, a sheet of the overnight rate target historically. So I'm going to scroll up, so hopefully you can follow on. So this is 2007. That's the date. The interest rate will be shown on this column, and the change I've calculated out here, and the duration. So I haven't given you all the data because this is by dates, and so sometimes it'll be years or months. And so I kind of like shrank everything down to just only to see the changes, and I'll show you how long that change lasted for. And so we're going to go all the way back to 2007, and so we'll start here at December 2007. And so in December 2007, the interest rates were 4.5%. Okay, and so that was the peak after our internet crash in 2001, and so rates had been low, and then they slowly crept back up to 4.5%. Okay, and December 2007. So hopefully you know your history a little bit. It's only 12 years ago that we had a financial crisis, which I kind of show you up here, a financial crisis in 2008, and so that's just about to happen. And so in December 2007, the fourth day, the overnight rate target dropped 0.25%. Okay, and so then it dropped again 0.25% only a month and a half later. And then another month and a half later, it dropped 0.5%, which is much more significant. Okay, and then another month and a half later, another 0.5%. Okay, and so we're looking at 1.5% drop in 4.5 months. Okay, and so at the financial crisis is happening right now, the interest rates plummeting because we're looking at monetary policy action trying to react to this financial crisis that's happening right now. And so you look here, 6 months later, it was stable at 3% for 6 months. That's not stable, but it's there. And then it dropped 0.5% again. And 12 days later, right? We're talking about 12 days, it dropped another 25 basis points. And then look here, 1 year later. So remember, we started at December 2007. Now we're at December 2008, and we're dropping 0.75%. Okay, we're looking at rapid acceleration of drops here. 5%, 0.5, 0.5, 0.25, 0.75, 0.5, 0.5, and we're dropping until we get down to April of 2009. Okay, and that dropped to 0.25%, which is coincidentally the same number we're at right now. Okay, and so if we go back to here, we had 4.5% of interest, which is not high already, right? Contextually, your lives have been lives of low interest rates, right? But 4.5% is not a low overnight rate target. And so in the span of 1.5 years of the 2008 financial crisis, the interest rate dropped 4.25%. Okay, all of that percentage disintegrated into a 0.25% overnight rate target. Okay, and so at this point, we kind of bottom. Well, we can't drop the overnight rate target anymore. We kind of bottom out, and so hopefully we're seeing the expansion or the recovery now, right? So 2009, 2010, and 2010 in June, the rates go up again, okay? And they go up again in July, and they go up again in September, right? And then they stay at 1% for 4 years. Over 4 years, they stay at 1%, right? So we're recovering from the crash in 2008, and now we're at 2015, or we're 2010, and then for 4 years we stay at 1%. The question here is, what was our economy like in this time frame? In this time frame right here, we're looking at growth. Like, we're starting to grow back, we're recovering. And so while our interest rates are starting to go up, they only go up to 1%, right? And we stay there for 4 years. Like, in that 4 year time frame, could we not have increased rates more? And so you might wonder, why would we increase rates more? Well, we would increase rates more because at 1%, we're still at tiny interest rates. And now we're dropping interest again. Okay, for a little brief hiccup right here in 2015. But then in 2017, rates start going up relatively quickly, up to 1.75%. And that's where we are, 2.5 years later from this 2017 part. We get to 1.75% in 2020. And that brings us to current times, right? Current times, we're March 3rd, 1.75%, 0.5 drop on March 4th, 0.5 drop on March 16th, 0.5 drop on March 27th, right? We're talking about 1.5% in 3 weeks. In less than a month, interest rates dropped an enormous amount. But here's the problem. Does our Bank of Canada want to do more interest rate drops? Possibly. But we're at 0.25% already, right? Maybe we needed more space at the top here. Maybe interest rates needed to have been higher than 1.75 there or higher than 1 here. I don't know, but all I do know is we can't drop rates much further than that unless we're trying to think about going into negative interest rates, which is a whole other conversation that's maybe beyond the lesson for today. But that's what countries do, and it can become problematic. So this is the recent interest rate history of Canada. And so I'm going to toggle back to our PowerPoint and kind of address another point. And so I hope that is relatively clear of about what the overnight rate target is and how it operates and what's happening with it. All those changes that we saw in the overnight rate target were monetary policy changes, right? Changes in the interest rate, because all these changes in interest rate change this rate and this rate, which are the bank and the borrowing rate. And if the banks here are spending more or borrowing more, that means they're going to charge every consumer more. So every time the overnight rate target will change, the bank rate will change, and then all of our rates as consumers of the bank will also change, right? And so that's how the Bank of Canada will impact the overnight rate target, which then will impact all of these rates as well. And so the next point down here is that it says other financial institutions will lend and borrow from each other within the operating band. And so why is this? Why will TD and Royal Bank operate in this band here or in this band here, right? So the whole point is that TD could borrow from Royal Bank, okay? But if TD borrows from Royal Bank, they'll never pay Royal Bank greater than this 4%. Why? Because then they'll just borrow from the Bank of Canada from 4%. The only motivation for TD to borrow from Royal Bank is if they can borrow at less than 4%. Right? In the same token, they won't pay, like they have to operate within this band because otherwise they just will operate with the Bank of Canada instead of each other. Right? So that's why all the charter banks operate inside this area versus outside this area. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Again, ask me questions if that's not clear. We'll kind of go over it the next Q&A. So the Bank of Canada looks at what's going on with our monetary policy. So we have to understand, what does the Bank of Canada actually own and operate with? And so let's look at the assets and liabilities. And so I'm going to show them all to you here because I'm going to talk about some of them in the same time frame. So the Bank of Canada balance sheet. So the assets of the Bank of Canada. And so we're going to talk about the bonds and advances first. So Government of Canada bonds, right? So if the Bank of Canada buys a Government of Canada bond, it means that they're lending the Government of Canada money. The Government of Canada has to pay back the Bank of Canada, and therefore that's an asset because that's an investment into something that they're going to receive money back at a later time. So it's the same as if you buy a bond, that means it's an asset for you. Okay. Next is advances to chartered banks. When the Bank of Canada will push money or deposit money into chartered banks, they're advancing money to the chartered banks, and therefore the chartered banks owe the Bank of Canada money, owe them back those deposits. Okay, so those are two assets of the Bank of Canada. I'm going to skip foreign exchange for now, and I'm also going to skip currency outstanding for now. Deposits of chartered banks and deposits of the federal government are liabilities for the Bank of Canada because this means that they have to pay back the charter banks and they have to pay back the federal government the deposits, which I hope is fairly straightforward. The same as if you have deposit money into your bank, that's a liability for the bank because they owe you money now. So they're basically borrowing money from you. So here, the Bank of Canada is borrowing money from the charter banks, it's borrowing money from the federal government. So the last two I want to talk about is foreign currency and currency outstanding. And so we'll talk about the liabilities first here. Currency outstanding, meaning the Canadian monetary unit. Okay, so the Canadian monetary unit theoretically is property of Canada, property of the Bank of Canada, because they've printed it. We're basically just borrowing it from them to enable us to do transactions. So that's why it's illegal to destroy money, kind of. Because that's not, it's federal property. So because the Bank of Canada and all Canadian institutions and the government have to honor our currency, right? So a foreigner who has our currency can use that currency to buy our goods or to transact in Canada, right? Any foreigner who comes to Canada with non-Canadian currency is not guaranteed to be able to make transactions, right? Someone could come here with, British pounds, and stores don't have to take that money because it's not Canadian currency, right? So the Bank of Canada has to honor Canadian currency, right? If foreign governments have Canadian currency, we honor that, or the Bank of Canada will honor that because they effectively want to get that back, right? It is a liability because that is wealth that has been removed from Canada, kind of, right? So in the same token, all foreign exchange, all foreign currency the Bank of Canada holds is an asset, right? Because they are holding assets of other currencies or other nations. They have their legal tender, right? That's why it's called legal tender. It's a legally binding or legal acceptable currency for your nation, right? And so the government backs it, the Bank of Canada backs it. They're basically saying we guarantee we will allow or we will use this currency. So hopefully that's clear about the currency. The other ones I think are relatively straightforward. So ultimately, what's the point? How does it work? What's going on? So in this scenario, if we want to stimulate the economy, we want to expand the economy, what are we going to do, right? So there are a few different things that can happen. So one, you can lower interest rates and or increase the money supply, right? We want to stimulate. We want things to happen. We want things to move. We want more spending. We want more borrowing, all these kinds of things, right? So we want to influence the economy to start to produce more. And so one, the Bank of Canada can shift money into the chartered banks, right? So we're going to push advanced money to the charter banks. And so what's going to happen? More reserves will exist. If more reserves exist, then there's more money to lend out to people. Lower rates will presumably happen or could happen. If there's more money to lend, there's more supply of loans, prices of loans will go down, and therefore more borrowing will happen. More borrowing happens, more spending happens, et cetera, right? So that kind of cycle starts to bump into more borrowing, more spending, more production, more employment, prosperity cycle kinds of things. So that's the one possible way. Two, you can lower interest rates. If the Bank of Canada will lower the overnight rate target, that will encourage borrowing, encourage spending, more purchasing, more investing. Okay, so fairly straightforward. That will happen. Three, increase money supply growth. Right, we can use the multiplier, the deposit multiplier, or the actual multiplier to increase what's happening in our economy through our monetary policy. Right, so. If we try to make our money grow faster, that circular flow to increase, the percentage of spend to increase, encouraging us to not save, to spend more, that will increase our output in the economy, that will increase our aggregate demand. The last one is to increase their own spending, right? So if they increase their own spending, aggregate demand and GDP will increase. And so if we want to contract the economy, the opposite things happen. So I don't have a slide for this, but instead of lowering interest rates, you'll increase interest rates. Instead of increasing money supply, you lower money supply. So all the same kind of opposite effects will happen if you want to contract the economy. And so what does this actually look like? And so this is your favorite part, I'm sure. We're looking at an aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. So aggregate supply is the elastic at low levels, inelastic at high levels. Aggregate demand at full employment is here. So again, this is our ideal situation. We want to be here. We're looking at scenarios. How do we get back to full employment aggregate demand? And so our first scenario, aggregate demand is low, so output is low, and we're in recessionary gap. Okay, so if we're in this situation, monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy needs to happen. So we want to decrease interest rates and increase money supply, and that will increase aggregate demand. Okay. Our next scenario is if aggregate demand 2 exists and we have inflationary gap. Prices are too high, output's great, employment's great, but inflation's too is not good. And so here, contractionary monetary policy is what we want to do. And so we want to increase interest rates and we want to decrease money supply. So, and that will hopefully bring us from aggregate demand 2 back down to full employment aggregate demand. And so, that concludes our tools of monetary policy lesson. I hope that it makes sense. Please read the text as well. Send me questions if you don't understand anything. Again, Willie will take some time to let you catch up and do some work, as well as do some Q&A sessions to make sure that you are understanding what's going on. So again, send me questions for clarification. Make sure you read and do all the homework to make sure that you are getting what's going on. All right, thank you.